My parents believed the lies of my stepsister and threw me out of the house, canceled my education when I was in my final year, and left me with nothing. Now, 3 years later, they came begging me to save them from bankruptcy. You know how they say life can change in an instant? Yeah, well, I used to think that was just something people said in movies. Boy, was I wrong. I grew up in one of those picture-perfect suburbs outside Boston, where the lawns are always green and the mailboxes never have dents. My dad was this hotshot cardiac surgeon who worked at Mass General, and my mom had her own interior design business that catered to wealthy clients in Newton and Brookline. They weren't just successful, they were the kind of people other parents pointed to when they wanted to motivate their kids. And me? I was their golden boy. 6'2", quarterback on the varsity team, honor roll student heading straight for Harvard on a full ride. I had everything mapped out. 4 years at Harvard, then maybe law school or business school, following a family tradition of success. Life felt like it was on autopilot, and I loved every minute of it. When I was 14, my parents decided to adopt. They'd been trying for years to have another kid after me, but it just wasn't happening. That's when Ashley came into our lives. She was 9 years old, this tiny blonde girl who'd been bounced around the foster system for most of her childhood. Her biological parents had their rights terminated when she was 7, and she'd been through 3 different homes before landing with us. I remember the day we picked her up from the adoption agency. Mom had been planning for weeks, buying new furniture for what used to be the guest room, filling it with stuffed animals and princess decorations. Ashley barely spoke that first month. She'd just sit in the corner of the living room, watching us like she was waiting for someone to tell her it was time to pack up and leave again. But slowly, she started to come out of her shell. I made it my mission to be the best big brother possible. I taught her how to ride a bike in our driveway, helped her with homework, scared away the neighborhood kids who tried to pick on her. She started calling me her protector, and honestly, it felt good to have someone look up to me like that. High school flew by in a blur of football games, college prep, and family dinners where Dad would tell stories from the hospital and Mom would show us pictures of her latest renovation projects. Ashley was thriving too, making friends, joining the school choir, becoming this confident kid who lit up every room she walked into. College was everything I'd hoped for, and more. Harvard was exactly like you'd imagine, ivy-covered buildings, professors who'd written the textbooks we studied, classmates who were destined to run the world someday. I was majoring in economics with a minor in political science, already planning my route to a top-tier MBA program. I played intramural football to stay in shape, and joined a few clubs that looked good on resumes. The best part was coming home for breaks and seeing how proud Ashley was of her big brother at Harvard. She was in high school by then, 15 and starting to date, which meant I got to play the intimidating older brother role whenever some pimply-faced kid came to pick her up. Life was good, really, really good. Spring semester of my junior year, I was 21 and felt like I had the world figured out. I was dating this amazing girl named Rebecca from my economics class. My GPA was solid, and I'd already started networking for summer internships at investment firms in New York. The future looked brighter than a Red Sox championship parade. That's when everything went sideways. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March. I remember because I just finished a brutal workout at the gym and was planning to grab dinner with my roommate before hitting the library. My phone rang, and I saw Dad's name on the caller ID. That wasn't unusual. He called every couple weeks to check in, ask about grades, maybe complain about the Patriots' draft picks. But something was different about this call. His voice was ice cold in a way I'd never heard before. No small talk, no asking about school. Just 4 words that made my blood freeze. Come home right now. I tried asking what was wrong. If someone was hurt, if there had been an accident. Nothing. He just repeated those same 4 words and hung up. My hands were shaking as I threw some clothes into a backpack and jumped in my car for the 2-hour drive home. The whole way there, my mind was racing through possibilities. Had something happened to Mom? Was Ashley hurt? Had there been some kind of medical emergency? Dad was a surgeon. He dealt with life and death situations every day. For him to sound that shaken, it had to be something serious. I pulled into our circular driveway around 7 that evening and immediately knew something was very wrong. Uncle Frank's truck was parked out front, which was weird because he lived in New Hampshire and usually only came around for holidays. There were lights on in every room of the house, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Uncle Frank met me at the front door, and let me tell you, this guy was not happy to see me. Frank was my dad's younger brother, ex-Marine who'd done 2 tours in Iraq before coming home to work construction. He was the kind of guy who could bench press a Buick and wasn't afraid to remind you of it. The look on his face when he opened that door was pure hatred. He didn't say a word, just grabbed my arm and marched me into the living room like I was some kind of criminal. The whole family was there. Mom sitting on the couch with tears streaming down her face, Dad standing by the fireplace looking like he wanted to put his fist through the wall, and Ashley curled up in the corner chair, sobbing like her heart was broken. That's when I knew this wasn't about medical emergency or a car accident. This was about me. Whatever was happening, I was at the center of it. Dad looked at me with more disgust than I'd ever seen him show another human being, and that's when he laid out the accusation that would destroy everything I'd ever worked for. Ashley had told them I'd been inappropriate with her. More than inappropriate. She'd painted a picture of her big brother as some kind of predator who'd been threatening and manipulating her for years. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. The room started spinning, and I could barely process what I was hearing. This was Ashley, my little sister who I'd taught to ride a bike, who I'd scared bullies away from, who called me her protector, and now she was sitting there, tears streaming down her face, nodding along as my parents described the most horrible version of myself I could imagine. I tried to explain, tried to defend myself, tried to make them understand that this was impossible. But nobody wanted to hear it. In their minds, Ashley was a victim, and I was a monster who betrayed everyone's trust. The golden boy had fallen, and there was no coming back from this kind of accusation. That night changed everything. Not just my relationship with my family, but my entire understanding of how quickly a life could be dismantled. I went to bed that Tuesday night as a Harvard student with a bright future, and woke up Wednesday morning as someone nobody wanted to believe. The next morning felt like waking up in someone else's nightmare. I'd spent the night in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had just happened. The Pokemon posters I'd never bothered taking down seemed to mock me from the walls. Here I was, 21 years old, and my world had just imploded because of accusations I couldn't even wrap my head around. Mom knocked on my door around 8, but she wouldn't even look at me when I opened it. She just handed me a cup of coffee and told me Dad wanted to talk before he left for work. The coffee was black. She'd remember how I liked it, which somehow made everything worse. Even in the middle of this chaos, she was still being my mom, and that just twisted the knife deeper. Dad was waiting in his study, still wearing his scrubs from an early morning surgery. This was the same room where he'd helped me with algebra homework and taught me how to tie a tie. Now it felt like I was walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. He laid out the situation with surgical precision. Ashley had come to them 3 days earlier, finally working up the courage to tell them what her big brother had been doing to her. The details she'd given them were specific enough to be believable, but vague enough that I couldn't point to any particular moment and say it was impossible. According to her story, I'd been gradually escalating inappropriate behavior since she was about 13. It started with uncomfortable comments about how she was developing, then moved to unwanted physical contact when nobody else was around. She claimed I'd threatened her, told her nobody would believe her if she said anything, used my golden boy status as leverage to keep her quiet. The worst part was how perfectly it all fit together. Ashley had become more withdrawn over the past couple of years, something we'd all attributed to typical teenage mood swings. She'd stopped wanting to hang out with me as much, which I'd figured was just her growing up and getting interested in boys her own age. Looking back through this new lens, every innocent interaction took on a sinister meaning. I tried explaining that none of it was true, that Ashley was like a real sister to me, that I'd never even thought about her in any inappropriate way. Dad just sat there, stone-faced, occasionally nodding like he was taking notes for a medical chart. When I finished, he told me he'd already spoken with a family lawyer about how to handle the situation. They weren't going to press charges yet. That was their one concession to the 21 years they'd spent raising me. But I was no longer welcome in their house, and they were cutting off all financial support effective immediately. No more tuition payments, no more allowance, no more family credit card for emergencies. I had until noon to pack my stuff and get out. The thing that really got to me was Ashley herself. She'd stayed in her room all morning, and when I knocked on her door to try to talk to her, she wouldn't even answer. I could hear her crying in there, and part of me wanted to believe those were tears of guilt, that she was going to come clean any minute and admit she'd made the whole thing up. But that never happened. If anything, she seemed to double down on her story. When I finally saw her as I was loading my car, she looked at me with this mixture of fear and disgust that felt like a punch to the gut. This was the same girl who used to run to me when she had nightmares, who'd beg me to teach her how to throw a football, who'd made me a birthday card every year with crayon drawings of us as stick figures. Uncle Frank supervised my packing process, like I was some kind of flight risk. Every few minutes, he'd make some comment about what he'd do to guys like me back in the Marines, how they handle predators in his unit. I kept my mouth shut because arguing with Frank was like arguing with a brick wall that could bench press 300 pounds. The hardest part was facing my belongings. 21 years of life reduced to a few suitcases and boxes. Trophies from high school football, photos of family vacations, books I collected since elementary school. Suddenly it all felt contaminated. How do you pack up memories when half of them now came with asterisks? I grabbed my laptop, some clothes, and a few textbooks, leaving behind pretty much everything else. The family photos hurt too much to look at, and the trophies felt like monuments to a person who no longer existed. Mom stood in the doorway, watching me pack, occasionally starting to say something before stopping herself. I could tell part of her wanted to believe me, but Ashley's word carried more weight than mine now. The drive back to campus was the longest 2 hours of my life. I kept checking my phone, hoping someone would call and tell me this was all a misunderstanding, that Ashley had admitted she'd made it up, that my family wanted me to come home, but the phone stayed silent. When I got back to Harvard, I had to face the practical reality of my situation. Without my parents' financial support, I couldn't afford tuition for senior year. My partial academic scholarship covered maybe 30% of the costs, and there was no way I could make up the difference with a part-time job. I was 3 semesters away from graduating from one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and suddenly that degree might as well have been on Mars. My roommate Jake took one look at my face and knew something catastrophic had happened. I gave him the basics. Family emergency, financial problems, might have to take a leave of absence. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the real reason. How do you explain to your best friend that your little sister has accused you of being a predator? The next few days were a blur of meetings with financial aid counselors, academic advisors, and student services representatives. Everyone was sympathetic, but ultimately helpless. Harvard doesn't exactly have a payment plan for students whose families have disowned them over false accusations of inappropriate behavior. I tried calling home a few times, hoping to reach Mom when Dad wasn't around, thinking maybe I could reason with her, but she'd either hang up immediately or tell me not to call anymore. The one time I got through to her for more than 30 seconds, she just cried and told me how disappointed she was, how they trusted me with Ashley, and I betrayed that trust. 2 weeks after that night in the living room, I was officially on academic leave from Harvard. My professors were understanding, but couldn't hold my spot indefinitely. My girlfriend Rebecca started asking too many questions about why I was suddenly broke and depressed, so I broke up with her rather than try to explain. Jake offered to let me crash on his couch for a while, but I couldn't stand the pity in his eyes every time he looked at me. I packed what was left of my belongings into my 10-year-old Honda Civic and headed west, with no particular destination in mind. I had about $800 in my checking account, no job prospects, and a family that believed I was capable of hurting the person I'd sworn to protect. The American dream, right? Work hard, get good grades, follow the rules, and everything will work out fine. Except sometimes life throws you a curveball that shatters everything you thought you knew about fairness and justice. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally decide you're not worth fighting for. As I crossed the state line into New York, I caught myself thinking about all those movies where the wrongly accused hero eventually gets vindicated, where the truth comes out and everyone realizes they made a terrible mistake. But this wasn't a movie, and real life doesn't always have happy endings. I was 21 years old, essentially homeless, and completely alone in the world. The golden boy had fallen, and there was no safety net waiting to catch him. 3 months after leaving Boston, I found myself in Nebraska of all places, working on a cattle ranch outside of town so small it made Mayberry look like Manhattan. The owner, a weathered guy named Pete, paid me cash under the table and didn't ask questions about my past. All he cared about was whether I could fix fences and move hay bales without complaining. The work was brutal but honest. 12-hour days in the blazing sun, sleeping in a converted barn that smelled like diesel fuel and cow manure. But it kept my hands busy and my mind off the fact that my entire life had been flushed down the drain by a lie I still couldn't understand. The other ranch hands were mostly Mexican immigrants who worked twice as hard as me for half the recognition, and they taught me more about real perseverance than 4 years of prep school ever had. The problem was the nights. When the work stopped and the silence crept in, that's when the anger and confusion would hit me like a freight train. I'd lie in that narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Ashley, looking for clues I'd missed, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. I started drinking to shut up the voices in my head. Nothing dramatic at first, just a couple of beers after work to help me sleep. But a couple became 4, then 6. Then I'd wake up with empty bottles scattered around my bunk and no memory of how they'd gotten there. Pete noticed but didn't say anything for a while. Ranch work is hard, and a lot of guys self-medicate to get through it. The breaking point came on a Saturday night in August. I'd driven into town to cash my paycheck and ended up at this dive bar that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. I was working on my 7th or 8th beer when some local yokel started running his mouth about college boys who thought they were better than everyone else. Normally I would have ignored him, but something about his tone reminded me of Uncle Frank that night in the living room, that look of absolute certainty that I was garbage who deserved whatever was coming to me. Before I knew it, I was on my feet, and then I was swinging, and then 3 guys were holding me down while the original loudmouth used my face as a punching bag. I woke up in the county hospital with a concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and a sheriff's deputy asking if I wanted to press charges. Pete was there too, looking disappointed but not particularly surprised. He drove me back to the ranch, helped me pack my stuff, and paid me what he owed plus a little extra for medical bills. Then he told me I was too messed up to be around his other workers and suggested I get my life sorted out before someone got seriously hurt. So there I was again, loading my Honda with everything I owned, nursing bruised ribs and a black eye that made me look like exactly the kind of guy parents warn their daughters about. I had maybe $400 left and nowhere to go. The rational part of my brain knew I should probably head back east, maybe try to find work in the city where I could blend in and start over. But rational thinking hadn't been my strong suit lately. Instead, I drove aimlessly through Kansas and Missouri, picking up odd jobs when I could find them, sleeping in my car when I couldn't afford a motel room, construction work, dishwashing, loading trucks at warehouses, anything that paid cash and didn't require references or background checks. It was a far cry from the corner office I'd once imagined myself occupying, but it kept me fed. The drinking got worse. I'd tell myself I was just having a couple to unwind after work, but pretty soon I was starting earlier in the day and finishing later at night. The guys I worked with were mostly in the same boat, men who'd had their lives derailed by divorce, addiction, bad luck, or bad choices. We didn't talk much about our past, but there was an understanding that everyone was running from something. By October, I was in Illinois working at a grain elevator and living in a weekly rate motel that charged by the day if you looked too desperate. The place was exactly as depressing as you'd imagine: stained carpets, flickering fluorescent lights, and neighbors who either screamed at each other all night or were too high to make noise at all. One particularly bad night, after I'd been laid off in the grain elevator for showing up drunk, I found myself sitting in my car outside a liquor store, counting the crumpled bills in my wallet. I had enough money for either a bottle of whiskey or another night at the motel, but not both. The choice felt symbolic somehow. Get drunk and sleep in my car, or stay sober and have a roof over my head for one more night. I bought the whiskey. That night, parked under an overpass outside Peoria, I made the decision that had been lurking in the back of my mind for weeks. I was tired of being angry, tired of being broke, tired of wondering what Ashley's real reasons had been for destroying my life. Most of all, I was tired of being me. There was an old railroad bridge about 20 miles outside town that crossed a river deep enough to do the job. I'd driven past it a dozen times during my brief stint at the grain elevator, and something about it had always caught my attention. It was isolated, sturdy, and tall enough that there wouldn't be any chance of screwing things up and ending up paralyzed instead of dead. The next evening, I drove out to that bridge with my mind made up. I'd finished the whiskey and was working on a six-pack of beer for courage. The sun was setting behind the trees, and the whole scene had this peaceful, final quality that felt appropriate for what I was planning to do. I parked the car and walked out onto the bridge, looking down at the dark water below. It was quiet except for the wind through the trees and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. I thought about my parents, wonder if they'd even care when they heard the news. I thought about Ashley and whether she'd feel guilty or relieved that her problem had solved itself. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw this old guy walking toward me, probably in his 60s, wearing faded jeans and a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap. He had the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen more than his share of hard times, but his eyes were kind of a way that made me think of my grandfather. He introduced himself as Walter and asked if I had a minute to talk. Now, I'd expected a lot of things in that moment. Maybe a security guard telling me to get off the bridge, or some concerned citizen calling the cops. But I hadn't expected a casual conversation with a stranger who acted like finding someone contemplating suicide was just another Tuesday for him. Walter didn't lecture me about the value of life or try to guilt me into changing my mind. Instead, he just started talking about the weather, about how the corn crop was looking this year, about his old pickup truck that kept breaking down but was too stubborn to die. Just regular conversation. Like we were sitting in a diner instead of on a bridge where I'd been planning to end my life. After about 10 minutes of this, he asked if I wanted to grab some coffee and tell him what had brought me to this particular bridge on this particular night. Something about his tone, not pushy, not judgmental, just genuinely interested, made me realize I hadn't had a real conversation with another human being in months. So we drove into town in our separate vehicles and ended up at a 24-hour diner that looked like it had been preserved from the 1950s. I found myself telling Walter the whole story: Harvard, Ashley's accusations, losing everything, the drinking, the dead-end jobs, the growing certainty that I'd never be anything more than the person everyone believed I was. Walter listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question, but mostly just letting me talk. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee and looking out the window at the empty parking lot. Then he told me something that changed everything. He believed me, not because he knew me or had any particular insight into my character, but because he'd met enough broken people to recognize the difference between genuine pain and manipulative self-pity. He said I reminded him of himself at a certain point in his life, after he'd come back from Vietnam and discovered that the world didn't much care about his service or his struggles. Walter offered me something I'd given up hope of finding, a chance to start over. He owned a small security company that provided guards for construction sites and office buildings around Chicago. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and he had a small apartment above his office that I could rent cheap until I got back on my feet. More importantly, he offered me something I had been missing since that night in my parents' living room, someone who was willing to give me the benefit of the doubt. As we sat in that diner, talking until the sun came up, I realized I had a choice to make. I could go back to that bridge and finish what I'd started, or I could take a leap of faith with this Vietnam vet who'd probably saved more lives than he'd ever taken credit for. I chose Walter. Working for Walter turned out to be exactly what I needed, even though I didn't realize it at first. His security company wasn't anything fancy, just him, 2 other full-time guards, and whatever part-timers he could scrape together for bigger contracts. But Walter ran it with military precision and treated everyone who worked for him like family. The apartment above his office was basic, but clean, one bedroom, a kitchenette, and a bathroom that actually had hot water most of the time. After months of sleeping in my car in flea-bag motels, it felt like the Ritz-Carlton. More importantly, it gave me a stable address and a sense of belonging somewhere, even if that somewhere was above a security company in an industrial part of Chicago. Walter didn't just give me a job. He gave me structure. Morning check-ins, regular routes, detailed reports on everything we observed during our shifts. It was simple work, mostly just being visible to deter theft and vandalism, but it required reliability and attention to detail, qualities I let slide during my months of drifting. The first few weeks were rough. My body was still detoxing from all the alcohol, and my sleep patterns were completely screwed up from months of irregular schedules. But Walter was patient in a way that reminded me of the best drill sergeants in war movies. Tough when he needed to be, but always fair and always focused on making you better rather than tearing you down. He also had zero tolerance for self-pity, which was exactly what I needed. Whenever I started feeling sorry for myself or dwelling on what happened with my family, Walter would find me extra work to do or launch into a story about some guy he'd known in Vietnam who'd had it worse and still managed to build a decent life after the war. The other guards, Tommy and Miguel, were good guys who'd both had their share of setbacks. Tommy was a former Chicago cop who'd been forced out after a corruption scandal he wasn't actually involved in, and Miguel was an Army veteran who'd struggled with PTSD after tours in Afghanistan. We didn't talk much about our past lives, but there was an understanding that everyone deserved a second chance. After about 3 months, Walter sat me down and told me I needed to see someone about what had happened to me. Not because he thought I was crazy, but because carrying around that much anger and confusion was going to poison everything good I tried to build going forward. He'd already found a therapist who specialized in trauma and false accusations, and he was willing to pay for the first few sessions until I could afford it myself. Dr. Martinez turned out to be this no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd worked with everyone from war veterans to abuse survivors. She didn't try to convince me that everything happens for a reason, or that my family's betrayal was somehow a blessing in disguise. Instead, she helped me understand that healing didn't require forgiveness, and that I could build a good life without needing validation from people who'd chosen not to believe me. The sessions were brutal at first. Talking about Ashley's accusations and my family's reaction brought back all the rage and helplessness I'd been trying to drink away. But gradually, Dr. Martinez helped me separate the pain of what had happened from my sense of self-worth. I started to understand that other people's inability to see the truth didn't change who I actually was. Around month 6 of working for Walter, he mentioned that his niece Chloe was coming to town for a construction project and might need some extra security for her job sites. Chloe was an architect who specialized in renovating old buildings in downtown areas, and she landed a contract to convert an abandoned factory into loft apartments. I expected another grizzled professional, maybe a female version of Walter who'd learned to navigate the construction world through sheer toughness. Instead, Chloe turned out to be this petite redhead with green eyes and an infectious laugh who could redesign a building's entire layout while explaining why the Bears' offensive line was garbage. She was Walter's brother's daughter, and she'd inherited the family combination of intelligence, work ethic, and complete intolerance for anyone trying to take advantage of her. The first time we met, she looked me up and down like she was evaluating structural integrity, and then asked Walter if I knew anything about construction beyond standing around looking intimidating. Working Chloe's job sites was different from the usual security gigs. Instead of just walking around empty buildings at night, I was part of a team trying to create something new. Chloe treated everyone on her crew, from the electricians to the security guards, like their input mattered, and she had this way of making even routine work feel important. She also had no patience for my tendency towards self-isolation. Whenever I tried to eat lunch alone or skip the after-work drinks that the crew sometimes organized, she'd call me out on it, not in a pushy way, but with this matter-of-fact observation that healing required community, not just individual effort. Chloe was the first person outside of Walter and Dr. Martinez who knew my full story, and her reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for but never expected. She listened to everything, the accusations, the family rejection, the months of drinking and drifting, and then asked practical questions about how I was dealing with it now. No drama, no pity, just genuine concern about my well-being and concrete suggestions for moving forward. The transition from professional relationship to personal friendship to something more happened gradually over the course of that construction project. Chloe would stay late to review blueprints, and I'd stick around to make sure she got to her car safely. Those conversations in the empty building, surrounded by sawhorses and paint cans, were some of the most honest I'd ever had with another person. She told me about her own struggles, growing up with parents who'd wanted a son, fighting for respect in a male-dominated industry, a previous relationship with a guy who tried to control her career ambitions. I told her about the guilt I still carried over Ashley, the fear that maybe there had been something inappropriate about my behavior that I'd been too naive to recognize. Chloe had this way of cutting through psychological complexity with architectural logic. She pointed out that buildings either had solid foundations or they didn't, that you could tell the difference between structural damage and cosmetic problems if you knew what to look for. People were more complicated than buildings, but the basic principle was the same. You could usually distinguish between genuine problems and surface-level issues. By the time her construction project was finished, Chloe and I were officially dating, though it felt more like we'd become partners in the project of rebuilding my life. She encouraged me to think about going back to school, maybe finishing my degree through night classes or online programs. She also pushed me to consider that my family's reaction said more about their character than mine. Walter watched our relationship develop with a satisfied expression of someone whose matchmaking efforts had worked out exactly as planned. He later admitted that he'd specifically requested Chloe for that construction project because he thought we'd be good for each other, which explained why she'd been so interested in my background from day one. A year and a half after meeting Walter on that bridge, I found myself in a place I'd never expected to reach. Genuinely happy. I had work that mattered, friends who had my back, a woman who loved me for who I was rather than who I'd once been expected to become, and a sense of purpose that didn't depend on other people's approval. The proposal happened on another construction site, because of course it did. Chloe was showing me the plans for her next project, a community center in a neighborhood that hadn't seen new investment in decades. When I realized I wanted to be part of every project she'd ever work on, not just the professional ones, but the personal project of building a life together. I didn't have much money for a ring, but Walter helped me design something using his mother's diamond in a setting that reflected Chloe's love of clean, geometric lines. When I got down on one knee in that empty lot, surrounded by urban decay that she was planning to transform into something beautiful, her answer was immediate and enthusiastic. Walter walked her down the aisle at our small wedding 6 months later, and I realized I'd gained something I thought I'd lost forever, a real family. Not the kind you're born into, but the kind you choose and build through shared commitment and genuine care. It was smaller than the family I'd started with, but it was stronger because it was based on truth rather than expectations. 3 years after Walter walked Chloe down the aisle, I thought I'd put my old life completely behind me. We bought a small house. I was managing Walter's company, and Chloe's architecture firm was taking off. Life was good in that quiet way people who survived hell learned to appreciate. Then my phone rang on a Tuesday morning, and I saw a number I hadn't seen in over 4 years. My mother. Mom's voice sounded older, more fragile than I remembered, and she was crying before she said hello. She told me Ashley had confessed. Just like that. No build-up, just the information I'd been waiting years to hear. Ashley, now 22, had finally admitted she'd made everything up. The confession happened during family therapy meant to help Ashley deal with supposed childhood trauma. Instead, she broke down and revealed she'd lied about everything. She'd been struggling with anxiety and depression since middle school, failing classes, experimenting with drugs. When caught shoplifting at 15, she panicked and deflected attention onto me instead of facing consequences. The accusation started as desperate damage control, but one said she couldn't figure out how to take them back. So she doubled down, convincing herself that destroying my life was justified, because I'd had it easier growing up. Mom wanted to meet, to apologize and make things right. Dad had aged a decade since throwing me out, developing health problems that forced early retirement. Their finances had collapsed. They'd sold the Newton house. Mom's business suffered, and they were facing foreclosure. After discussing it with Chloe and Walter, I agreed to meet them at a downtown Chicago coffee shop. Seeing my parents after 4 years was surreal. Dad looked smaller, defeated, with gray hair and hunched shoulders. Mom had aged better physically, but her eyes carried a sadness that hadn't been there before. They apologized profusely. Dad cried, something I'd never seen even at his own father's funeral. They explained how sorry they were, how they thought they were protecting Ashley by believing her without question. What struck me most was how broken they looked. The confident, successful couple who'd raised me had been replaced by two people who'd been through their own hell. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I felt sad for everyone involved. Then came the real reason for the meeting. Their financial problems were worse than Mom had admitted. Dad's early retirement cost him his full pension, and Ashley's college and therapy had drained their savings. They were facing bankruptcy and needed help. They weren't directly asking for money, but the implication was clear. They wanted their son back, wanted a successful future they planned for me to include taking care of them in their decline. I looked at these people who'd given me 21 years of advantages, who'd taught me values and work ethic. I also saw them as the people who discarded me without hesitation when told I was damaged goods. My response wasn't what they hoped for. I told them I was glad Ashley found courage to tell the truth, and I hoped she got help for whatever motivated her lies. I was grateful for my upbringing and understood they thought they were protecting her. But forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. They'd chosen to cut me out completely, and I'd built a new life without them. That life included people who'd supported me when I had nothing, who'd earned my loyalty through actions rather than biology. I introduced Chloe properly and told them about Walter, the security company, the life we'd built. I wanted them to understand I wasn't the broken person they'd left behind, but someone who'd found happiness on different terms than they'd planned. As for their financial problems, I wished them well but made clear I couldn't help. Not because I couldn't afford it. We were doing fine, but because helping would send the wrong message about consequences and accountability. They'd chosen Ashley's word over mine when it mattered most. Now they face the effects of that choice, just like I'd faced consequences of being falsely accused. I'd survived and built something good from the wreckage. They'd have to figure out their own survival. The meeting ended awkwardly. Walking to our car, Chloe asked if I felt better or worse. Honestly, I felt relieved. For 4 years, I'd fantasized about them realizing their mistake and begging forgiveness. Now that it happened, I realized the fantasy was about vindication, not reconciliation. I'd wanted them to admit I was right, and they had, but I'd moved beyond needing their validation. 6 months later, Chloe told me she was pregnant. We're expecting our first child in spring, and Walter's already building a crib, insisting the baby call him Grandpa Walter. That feels exactly right. I think about my biological family sometimes. Hope Ashley found peace with her choices. But mostly I focus on the family I've chosen and the one we're creating. It's smaller than what I started with, but it's built on truth and respect rather than expectations and obligations. The irony is that losing everything taught me what actually mattered. Success isn't about perfect parents or Ivy League degrees. It's about finding people who see your worth when you can't see it yourself, building something meaningful from whatever materials life gives you. Walter says some people are born into good families. Others have earned them. I'm grateful I ended up in the second category, even though the journey nearly killed me. The family you choose sticks around when things get tough, because they've seen you at your worst and decided you were worth the investment. It's not the life I planned at 21 when I thought I had everything figured out. But it's better than anything I could have imagined, because it's real in a way my old life never was. Sometimes the worst thing that happens turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. You just have to survive long enough to figure out the difference. Thanks for listening to my story. I know it's heavy, but I wanted to share it because there are probably other people who've been falsely accused or had families turn on them. You're not alone, and it's possible to build something good from the wreckage. If this resonated with you, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. It helps reach people who might need to hear that things can get better. Drop a comment with your thoughts or share your story if you're comfortable. Thanks for listening.